This week, we are broadening our focus, taking advantage of the best Washington Week has to offer. Our panelists. We've gathered as many of them as we could find to talk about the events of the past year, how it looked up close at the White House, in Congress, at the Pentagon, at the Supreme Court, and around the country and world. You couldn't find a better group of analysts anywhere in Washington, so I'll go right to my first question. A year later, we have had laws passed, we have had debates held in all of these branches of government, including at the highest levels of government, and yet Americans on the anniversary this week didn't necessarily feel safer. Is there anything that government has done in the past year, Dave Broder, which should have made us feel safer?
That's a hard question. I think the struggle to figure out where a society as open as ours can arm itself with knowledge about the people who may be seeking to harm it is an enormously difficult question for the people in government. They've struggled with it, but I can't say that I could fault them for what they've attempted to do.
Tom Jelton, these reserves have been called up. People whose lives have been affected, probably the most long-term in lots of ways, are people whose husbands and wives went off to war and haven't been back. Why aren't we feeling safer with that happening?
Because this is not, as has been pointed out so many times, an enemy that is in one place, in a known place, that has a capital, that has fixed assets that can be attacked. This is an enemy that is all around the world. It is possibly within us, and it is not a problem that really has an obvious military solution.
And remember, there's more than one enemy. I mean, just this week, while we were reflecting on Al-Qaeda and learning that there are still cells all over the world plotting, according to intelligence reports, we're focusing on Iraq and Saddam Hussein. We still really have no idea who was responsible for the anthrax attacks. So I think that really adds to the complexity of what it is that makes us feel insecure suddenly in this country. So many unknowns.
Gwen, I think a key word there is feel safer. I think a lot of us feel safer. Whether we are safer is probably a bigger question.
Do you feel safer?
I feel somewhat safer. I mean, you went to work this week and you could see outside the Pentagon there were missile batteries with live missiles, and you'd say, oh yeah, that makes me feel better. But then
that actually made me kind of nervous.
I know, me too. When would they use them? I mean, it just really wouldn't happen. The scenario for them actually using those missiles to protect us is not known.
But Martha, you work inside the building that's got the missiles outside.
Yes.
Most Americans don't. I think the problem is that our sense of vulnerability a year ago doubled or tripled or quadrupled. Suddenly we learned this universe of threats that we didn't know are out there, and all the things the government can do to fix that happen by inches and quarter inches. You've got the government trying to invent bureaucracies that are going to put new regulations into place. You know, every time John Ashcroft or Tom Ridge comes out and says, feel safer, but also feel unsafe.
But
worry, but don't worry. They get a certain amount of flack. I'm not sure they have any choice.
Well, I was going to say that sense of fear is what I think is ultimately going to drive the whole debate in Congress about whether we go, to war against Iraq. We are now a different country after 9/11, and we now know what happens if we avoid all of the warning signals, we think. Everything is a warning signal to us. So now we want to be sure that if we're going to go to war, we're doing it for the right reasons, but we also want to make sure that we do something to make the country feel like we're protecting them.
And we're in a very unfamiliar and very uncomfortable place. For the first time, the home front is the front line. And for the first time, we define national security as our own personal security. I remember Doyle wrote a piece this year saying, well, we'll know when the war on terror is won when we feel safe enough to go to the shopping center. I mean, this is a very extraordinary kind of war, and it has extraordinary kind of strains on the home front and, of course, the front line.
Well, we kept moving that front line, by the way. It became going to the shopping center, then going abroad, and then flying comfortably again. That line kept shifting, and still the war on terror isn't won.
I think our relationship with our government has changed, and it's kind of interesting. Right after 9/11, almost 60% of us felt that the government would do the right thing. And that's kind of counterintuitive for Americans. We're kind of hardwired to be skeptical about our government. Now it's back down to sort of 29%. thinking the government's going to do the right thing all the time. About a third of us, only a third of us, believe that a terrorist attack is less likely now. So, you know, we've seen the debate over Homeland Security. It's not done. Anybody been through an airport lately? People don't have a lot of faith in that. So we're cynical again about government, and that makes things much more difficult for a president.
But we're also left with this very strange position of the government giving us these warnings that we have no idea what to do with and how to interpret. And someone, you know, we've talked about before here on the show about the government trying to cover itself in case something happened. But as we said, it brings a more sense of fear when the government thinks they're helping us, but we're not sure they are.
And I think that government officials have changed their view of what they do. And I keep hearing members of Congress say, look, our primary responsibility is to protect Americans. And we fail at that, then everything else we're doing, whether it's prescription drugs or the economy, doesn't make sense.
Wait a second. Is that true that members of Congress now have embraced what the White House has obviously embraced, which is this notion that their primary mission is now protection and war making or some other form of protection, rather than the things which Americans say in polls that they want, which is Social Security reform and Medicare, prescription drug benefits?
I think they're struggling with that. Even someone like Dick Gephardt said it today. He said that what happens with Iraq is in many ways the most important thing. And so when you have someone like that saying it, who knows that his own re-election prospects and the prospects of his party taking control are dependent on domestic issues, he still feels strongly enough that he has to insert that caveat. That's significant.
Gwen, I can't help but think, for all the skepticism that's returned in the polls and so forth, I can't help but think this all has elevated what people think of their politicians and of the government, people running the government. Because when you think back a year ago, the focus on Gary Condit, the focus on controversies such as should arms be sold by gun dealers and so forth. Suddenly, the debate is so much bigger and broader. Should we go to war? How do we rebuild New York City? Questions about the economy, questions about domestic terrorism, questions about life and death. And I think people realize, whether they like it or not, they're turning back again to their politicians. And we're seeing that in the campaigns this year with the focus on security and politicians coming out and saying, I'll protect you, I'm experienced. There's a whole new return to that.
Well, and it seems like in connection with that as well, that one thing that is a big casualty of this whole period is this notion that was prevalent under Clinton that the era of big government is over. Well, that's over. I mean, there's a lot more, this is a bigger government now. It's a bigger, more expensive government with more power. It's doing different things than the conventional big government of great society and so forth. It's got more law enforcement power. You know, we're spending boodles more on Homeland Security and more on health programs.
But what happened then to the loyal opposition? What happened to the people in Congress or elsewhere in government and society who are supposed to be the ones who say, I agree with the president and back the president, except I disagree with him respectfully on these issues? Where are the Democrats?
Well, the Democrats have been confused for part of the last year because they are like all citizens. They were shaken by the events of September 11th. And they had pretty natural human reactions that they needed to do whatever it took to try to protect people and to support the president in his efforts to do that. And they have been pulled and tugged all year between wanting to be loyal on that front and at the same time having a partisan desire to take back the House, to hold control in the Senate. And so you see these, as we've mentioned before, this idea of a kind of a bifurcated sense of what they do. But the Democrats don't quite know where they want to stand on foreign policy, and I think that's the major conundrum that they have to resolve.
And Gwen, I think we're seeing much more of an emergence of the opposition and much more of an emergence of opposition in the distinct branches. We see the Democrats now holding hearings in the Senate on some of the administration's national security policies that could be infringing more on civil liberties, called up on some of the foreign intelligence policies that are happening domestically with spying. And you see the judiciary now taking a very active role in terms of the court cases that have moved along progressively. And I think what we've seen is just a more hardening of the roles of the three branches, of Congress feeling that it's now much more of a check on the administration, and the courts feeling like they have an important role to play now too.
Well, let's not forget.
I think you're seeing, I agree with Joan. One of the things we're seeing is the judges be more vocal about their objections, particularly to curtailment, or rather I'd say an expansion of law enforcement authority in some key areas. I mean, there are cases in, say, New Jersey and Detroit where judges are objecting to the detention of persons without benefit of counsel or without being charged. People may remember that over 1,000 people were detained at one point earlier in the year, and the administration would never tell us what their names were or whether they were charged with anything or why they were detained, except for the fact that they were immigrants. They didn't have the same rights that citizens would have. And you'll also see now much more discussion of the fact that 2 American citizens have been detained without access to counsel as so-called enemy combatants because they were detained overseas where they were aligned with groups that we consider to be terrorist organizations, and you're starting to see a lot more discussion about that.
Americans seem to be not particularly bothered by that, as far as I can tell.
They're starting to get more bothered, though, Gwen. In the beginning, it was really a pass for the government. You know, government could do anything. In fact, the polls showed that people were more afraid that government wouldn't do enough to catch people in the country. But now you see a little bit of an erosion. It's small, but it seems that the poll numbers are going in the opposite direction.
When I have to interject a note of skepticism, and I'm not happy about doing it, but it strikes me that this country is dealing with really big issues, and as Tom said earlier, the quality of the debate is pretty high, not just about war and on terrorism, so on. There was a very serious debate in this country about how to deal with corporate malfeasance, very serious debate about economic policy, but I have not been in a single state this year where the primary results showed more than a tiny fraction of the people doing the simplest act of citizenship, showing up to vote. I think there is a detachment from what's going on. There's a gap between the seriousness of the issues that before the country and the willingness of the public to engage with those issues.
Don't you think, David, that's in part because, in another way, everything we've seen traveling around over the last year is that part of what the experience of September 11th was a drawing inward among people. And so for people now, politics is not a kind of a natural act to engage in. And I think in one way or another, people will have to be drawn back in. It is interesting when you go out and talk to people, the issues that we think are consuming them are not necessarily consuming them. Particularly the role of campaigns. They don't see the relevance that we would assume. We have an election coming up in which the stakes are huge. And yet you don't get the sense as you go around the country that voters see this election as a defining or decisive election.
Right. In fact, the other thing we're underestimating, the other event over this last year was a change in the economy. And I know the NPR reporters have come back and one after another said in different ways that people are worried about their own well-being, and that would almost always fall behind September 11 and terrorism when they have to look very close to home.
You know, Gwen, I was earlier this week in Nashville with all of the state and local health officers. And Bob Blendon from Harvard came and talked a lot about what polling data over the past year has shown. And it was very interesting because sort of the conclusions that he had drawn is that people understood that 9/11 probably could not have been prevented. Nobody saw it coming, nobody anticipated it, that sort of thing. And Americans were understanding of that, but that in the surveys, they almost issue a warning to government. Now you better be on guard. You know, now we expect you to prevent it. And that's such a difficult task still when you think about it.
Alexis. One of the things that I think is interesting is how confusing it must be for the average American to figure out what it is they're supposed to do. Because in the past year, they've been told, go about your regular life, spend money, support the economy, do what you're always doing, right? And then they're also said, be vigilant. So the warnings are sort of non-specific, you should be more vigilant. They're confused about the safety. 19 people brought down, you know, a nation on a day by doing nothing illegal. They didn't do anything illegal, so the risks that they're feeling, they're not sure what they're supposed to target that to. And then in terms of actually volunteerism or sacrifice, there's been spotty introductions of that idea to the American people, very limited. What are you supposed to do to help your country be safer? And I think people are very confused, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're confused about their citizenship either.
When you get back to the disengagement of the public, I think back to an interview I had with Tom Ridge, now the Homeland Security Director. about 3 months before September 11th, when he was governor of Pennsylvania in charge of electing Republicans as governors. And I said, what's on your mind? And he said, the one thing I'm worried about that keeps me up at night is all the losses we're going to have in state houses around the country in 2002. And when you think about Tom Ridge worrying about that, it kept him up at night. And now the guy is worried. That's the last thing on his mind. He is worried about the security of this country. And when you think about that, it makes me think people have bigger things on their mind right now.
But wait, let's not draw the assumption that the voters are primarily and mostly and supremely worried about the war on terrorism, because all of the polls that we've all seen show that they still care about their own issues at home, you know, the education, the economy, jobs, health care, and that is what makes the Republicans nervous. Yes, the Democrats are having trouble getting their footing on issues, but the Republicans are also worried too, and that's what makes this election so interesting that's coming up.
Well, there might be, I think as David points out, a serious and a good debate in Washington, but there is not a vivid line in the country. In 1990, after the Kuwait invasion by Iraq, it was pretty clear. Most Democrats were going to be voting no on the resolution of war. I'd be surprised if there's anything like that division later this fall, or presumably when it comes, or possibly after the election, when there's a vote on Iraq. Democrats do not have the confidence to state that position forthrightly, maybe because a lot of them aren't so sure about their own views. I think also there's a lot of private skepticism of the Bush approach, but there's quite a bit of tentativeness about actually voicing that publicly.
Well,
it's
John,
not considered a winner.
John, you'll also remember, of course, one of the lessons for Democrats of the Gulf War was that voting against it was a bad idea until you found out how it came out.
Right.
We may find that there is a different kind of debate once we find out how a war in Iraq comes out in the end.
Well, let me just jump in here, because this reminds me of something which a year ago when we were having these conversations, Tom Friedman, who's not here tonight, but one of our panelists said he was in Jerusalem when the attacks happened, and he said, this is what World War III looks like. And it was the scariest thing in the world when he said that, because we didn't know what it meant. A year later, do we have any idea what that meant?
But what he was trying to say was that this is a totally new kind of war. Obviously, it wasn't like the first two. It was different in every respect. It was different in the way it affected us emotionally, the way it affected us politically. I think for the president, as he goes forward, and he seems to want to say that this is the most important part of what I do now and what we're all about now and what our politics is about, he's probably wrong to think it's just a matter of getting the Democratic Party on board in a vote in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. I mean, I do think that the public is way behind this conversation. I think they're in a completely different place about it. I think they're listening.
Which conversation?
About where we're going with respect to Iraq. And I think he has a huge uphill battle, because while they were just getting used to this one kind of war, this sort of terror campaign, he's asking really to put something completely new and different on the plate. We'll link it if you can, but it's a different it's a lot to ask the people to swallow all at once when they're still digesting this first new kind of conflict.
Yeah. Well, one reason it's not a world war is in real world wars you have generally the whole world arrayed one way or the other, and I think we're seeing in this case the United States is taking a position, but most of our allies approaching this question with great skepticism.
But it's become,
I think that's even more of an issue than the U.S. public.
It's become so much easier to imagine that world war now. The scenarios are so obvious. There's a half a dozen of them out there. It was much harder to imagine a year ago, but now it's very easy to imagine the Iraq thing turning out really messy. We got an Israeli-Palestinian conflict that could ignite a broader tension. We've got a potential nuclear confrontation between India and Pakistan that could be ignited by the eruption of some events somewhere else in the world. For example, if the Iraq thing turns out really messy and nuclear weapons get used in Iraq, now it's really easy to imagine how this whole mess could really go bad.
And Tom, the one thing we were really sure about in 1991 Iraq won. The Gulf War was where Saudi Arabia was, where its heart and mind was. And that's the thing we don't really know now, and the most unusual cast of characters are saying, let's cast Saudi Arabia adrift. They're not really our friends, and that's a very, very important place, has been since the mid-30s for the United States, and we don't know where they are and how we feel about them.
Is there any room in all of this talk of war, visions of war, even internal domestic wars, is there any room anymore for discussion about diplomacy? Is diplomacy just been totally kicked to the side? Every time Colin Powell says, let's talk about it, they go, no, we're not going to talk about it.
Diplomacy certainly hasn't been kicked to the side, but I think Colin Powell's last year has been so focused on the war on terrorism and so focused on bringing this coalition together. I mean, forget about the Mideast, particularly after that failed, after that last mission, that diplomacy has been put aside in the way for the broader sense, for Iraq, for what comes next. The country's been so focused, and the diplomats in Powell too, on this, that other things have suffered.
I think the president has been just as focused. And I think one of the reasons George Bush remains so popular in this country is that he told his staff, as you were saying, after 9/11, this is my mission. Terrorism is my mission. We don't want to think about the terrorists every day, but people are glad that somebody else is. And if it happens to be the President of the United States, that's great. And I think they believe him when he says this is his focus, because he's a straight talker. And I think that will help him sell the case on Iraq.
And I also don't think the country's so disengaged from policy, from what's happening right now. I think a lot of people in the country don't want to think about it. I mean, basically, people really don't feel safer, and they don't want to dwell on it. I mean, people needed a break this week from the 9/11 coverage. You had to walk out, you had to feel the wind, you had to get away from it. And I think the people want to focus on their own homes or their own checkbook instead of thinking about this all the time.
Well, you know, Gwen, even last fall, when here in Washington, when we were still so preoccupied with how the U.S. was going to respond, anthrax had gripped the Capitol, all you had to do was take a flight anywhere in America, and people weren't talking about this already. Even in November and December, a lot of people had moved on to, as they say, all politics are local, to the things that really mattered in their households.
Let me ask, because we're a bunch of reporters in this room, people who generally, theoretically, have the front row seat at history, the chance to ask the questions and get them answered from people, or not get them answered if you're Tom Jelton at the Pentagon.
Or the White House.
Or at the White House. Anyway, the point is, how have our jobs changed in this past year? Has it become more complicated? Has it become more clear the way it has for the president, for instance?
Well, I think it's become complicated for several reasons, Gwen. First is that many of us as reporters are dealing with subjects that perhaps we haven't dived into in the past. Think about anthrax. How many reporters knew anything about anthrax
or
until
Al-Qaeda
last fall, or Al-Qaeda for that matter, or so many of the complexities that have suddenly been thrust upon all of us. I also think that especially through last fall, it was a bit awkward for the media because we certainly did not want to seem unpatriotic. And there were times when people like the White House spokesman Ari Fleischer or Attorney General John Ashcroft absolutely said, if you're not with us, then you're with them. So it's been, I think many in the press have also had to find their way through these 12 months.
And I think it's difficult when there's less dissent in the country. Now I think we're seeing more of it, but at a period when politicians are unwilling to criticize the president or certain people, what's your role as a reporter? Do you seek out a tiny minority and court them and encourage them to speak out? Or do you simply reflect the fact that there's someone who will tell you off the record, I'm too scared to say anything because I know it might cost me my reelection?
There was a period of time, too, when we did reporting and you would hear back from readers or viewers that they were concerned that the media were revealing secrets that would put the nation at risk, when in fact it could have been the FBI who was participating in the story that described the whatever office space that they were putting aside for some emergency situation. And it was interesting for the public, too, to watch them wrestle with what we do every day and they expect us to do every day, and then their feeling of insecurity about what we were doing.
I had that experience just this week in reporting a piece about the international opposition, or at least skepticism toward the Bush administration's policy, and I can tell you that I got a lot of people saying, we don't care what they think. President Bush is the president of the United States, not the president of France. We don't care. And that shouldn't deter us from asking the question, but everyone doesn't want to hear the answer.
Final statement.
Added a whole new seriousness to what we do. I mean, we're all Americans. We're trying hard to tell the public what's going on, and it's hard penetrating the White House. It's hard finding out what's going on at the Pentagon, even with all these fights about war. And then we're sometimes accused of being unpatriotic, of leaking information, when the reality is we're trying to do our jobs.
It's a tough job, but we've got the best people in this room to do it. Thank you all for joining us. This has been an extraordinary conversation and a fascinating night for me. Thanks a lot. No matter how deep we dig, we never seem to get to the bottom of it all, but we made a valiant effort tonight. Thanks to all our panelists for joining us, and thanks to you, our viewers, for tuning in.